Liechtenstein, a country so small you could drive across it in under an hour, but don't let its size fool you. In this video, we uncover 10 jaw-dropping facts about one of the world's most secretive and powerful micronations. From royal rulers with real power to billionaire banking secrets, accidental invasions, and the ability to rent the entire country, Liechtenstein is full of surprises. Number 1. It has a prince who actually rules. Unlike most monarchies today, Liechtenstein's prince still holds real power, including the ability to veto laws, dismiss the government, and dissolve parliament. And guess what? The people support it. This tiny country between Austria and Switzerland is one of the last absolute monarchies in Europe, where the prince actually wields real political power. Let me help you understand how this works and why it's so unusual in our modern democratic world. To grasp what makes Liechtenstein special, let's start with understanding what we mean by our absolute monarchy versus the ceremonial monarchies most people are familiar with. Think about the United Kingdom, where Queen Elizabeth II was the official head of state but couldn't actually make political decisions. She was more like a symbolic figurehead. Now imagine the complete opposite, a monarch who can veto laws, dissolve parliament, appoint judges, and even threaten to sell the country if he disagrees with the people's decisions. That's essentially what we have in Liechtenstein. The current ruler is Prince Hans Adam II, though he's handed most day-to-day governing duties to his son, Prince Alois, who serves as regent. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't just a historical relic that nobody pays attention to anymore. These princes actively use their constitutional powers to shape the country's direction. Let me give you a concrete example that illustrates how this works in practice. In 2003, Liechtenstein held a referendum about whether to limit the prince's powers, essentially asking whether they wanted to become more like other European democracies. Prince Hans Adam II made an extraordinary threat. If the people voted to reduce his authority, he would simply sell the country or move elsewhere, taking the princely family's considerable wealth with him. The people voted to keep his powers intact. This wasn't just political theatre. The prince demonstrated that he saw his authority as non-negotiable. Now you might wonder how such an arrangement survives in the 21st century. Here's where we need to understand the unique circumstances that make this possible. Liechtenstein is remarkably small, only about 160 square kilometers, with roughly 39,000 residents. It's essentially the size of a mid-sized city. This scale creates a different kind of political relationship than what we see in larger nations. Think of it this way. In a country so small, politics becomes almost personal. The prince isn't some distant figure in a far-off capital. He's a neighbor who people might actually encounter in daily life. This proximity creates a different dynamic than the abstract relationship most citizens have with their heads of state. When your monarch lives down the road and the entire country can fit into a small valley, traditional democratic theory starts working differently. But size alone doesn't explain why Liechtenstein maintains its princely system. The more important factor is that this arrangement has delivered remarkable prosperity. Liechtenstein has one of the world's highest GDP per capita figures, virtually no unemployment, and excellent public services. The country has successfully positioned itself as a financial center and attracted numerous businesses through favorable tax policies and political stability. Here's a key insight. The prince's absolute powers might actually contribute to this success rather than hindering it. Because the prince can make decisions quickly without lengthy parliamentary debates or coalition negotiations, Liechtenstein can adapt rapidly to changing economic conditions. When global financial regulations change or new business opportunities emerge, the prince can adjust policies almost immediately. This agility becomes a competitive advantage that larger, more democratic countries struggle to match. Let's examine how this system actually functions in practice. The prince retains what constitutional scholars call reserve powers, authorities that he doesn't use regularly but can deploy when he believes it's necessary. These include the right to veto any law passed by Parliament, the power to dissolve Parliament and call new elections, and the authority to appoint judges. He also controls foreign policy, though Liechtenstein's small size limits how much independent foreign policy it can actually conduct. The Parliament, called the Landtag, does exist and does pass laws, but it operates knowing that the prince can overturn any decision he disagrees with. This creates an interesting political dynamic where democratic deliberation occurs within boundaries set by monarchical authority. Politicians must consider not just what voters want, but also what the prince will accept. What makes this particularly intriguing is how the system handles disagreement. In most democracies, when voters disagree with their leaders, they can vote them out of office. In Liechtenstein, if people disagree with the prince, their main recourse is to leave, and some do. The country has provisions for entire municipalities to secede if they're unhappy with national policies. This creates what economists call voting with your feet. If you don't like how the prince runs things, you can relocate to neighboring Austria or Switzerland. But here's what's remarkable: most people don't leave. Surveys consistently show that Liechtensteiners are among the most satisfied citizens in Europe. This suggests that the princely system, however unusual, is delivering something that residents value more than traditional democratic participation. To understand why this works, consider what political scientists call the social contract. In most democracies, the deal is, we give you the right to govern us, and in return you implement policies we support through our elected representatives. Liechtenstein's social contract is different. We allow you to rule us absolutely, and in return you make us prosperous and leave us alone in our daily lives. As long as both sides hold up their end of this bargain, the system remains stable. Number 2, it's a billionaire tax haven with no capital gains tax, no wealth tax, and famously tight banking secrecy. Liechtenstein has become a financial sanctuary for the ultra-rich. For decades, it was one of the most secretive tax havens in the world. The principality's role as a tax haven for billionaires and wealthy individuals isn't just an economic curiosity, it's actually fundamental to understanding how absolute monarchy survives in modern Europe. Let me walk you through how this works and why it matters so much. To understand Liechtenstein's position as a tax haven, we need to start with what that term actually means. Think of a tax haven as a country that deliberately creates favorable tax conditions to attract wealthy individuals and businesses from other nations. But Liechtenstein isn't just offering lower tax rates, it's providing something much more sophisticated: financial privacy, political stability, and what we might call wealth protection services that go far beyond simple tax reduction. Here's where we need to connect this back to the princely system we discussed earlier. The prince's absolute authority actually becomes a selling point for wealthy clients. When billionaires are looking for places to park their money, they want predictability above all else. Democratic countries can change their tax laws whenever voters elect new governments. But in Liechtenstein, major policy changes require the prince's approval. This creates a kind of policy insurance. Wealthy clients know that the rules won't change dramatically just because of an election. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice. Suppose you're a wealthy entrepreneur from Germany, where you might pay 45% in taxes on your highest income. You could establish residency in Liechtenstein and potentially pay as little as 12% on the same income. But the tax savings are just the beginning. You're also buying into a system where the prince has a personal interest in maintaining policies that attract and retain wealthy residents. Now here's where the relationship between wealth and political power becomes really interesting. Liechtenstein doesn't just passively attract wealthy individuals, it actively courts them through what's called economic citizenship. The country has created legal structures that allow wealthy foreigners to become residents relatively easily, bringing their money and business activities with them. These new residents then become stakeholders in maintaining the very system that attracted them in the first place. Think about this dynamic. When a significant portion of your population consists of wealthy individuals who chose to live there specifically because of the political and economic system, you create a constituency that has strong reasons to oppose major changes. These residents didn't just stumble into Liechtenstein's system, they actively selected it over alternatives. This creates what political scientists call selection effects that reinforce the existing order. But let's dig deeper into the specific mechanisms that make Liechtenstein attractive to billionaires. The country offers several sophisticated financial instruments that aren't available elsewhere. One is the Anstalt, a legal entity that's somewhat similar to a trust but with more flexibility and privacy protections. Another is the Stiftung or foundation, which allows wealthy individuals to transfer assets while maintaining some control over how they're used. These aren't just tax avoidance schemes, they're complex legal structures that can serve legitimate purposes like estate planning, philanthropy, and business organization. Here's a crucial point that many people miss. Liechtenstein's success as a tax haven depends on being more than just a place to hide money. The country has built an entire ecosystem of financial services, including private banks, asset management companies, trust services, and legal expertise. This creates what economists call agglomeration effects. When related businesses cluster together, they become more efficient and innovative than they would be in isolation. Let me help you understand how this connects to the country's political stability. When billionaires move significant assets to Liechtenstein, they become invested in the country's continued success and stability. If political upheaval or major policy changes threaten their wealth, they could potentially move their money elsewhere. This gives wealthy residents a kind of indirect political influence, not through voting necessarily, but through the economic leverage that comes from being able to relocate their wealth. Now, you might wonder how this system affects ordinary Liechtenstein citizens who aren't billionaires. Here's where we see some fascinating dynamics at work. The wealth that flows into the country from tax haven activities generates significant economic benefits for everyone. High net worth individuals don't just park money in accounts. They buy property, hire local services, invest in businesses, and pay various fees and taxes, even at the reduced rates. This creates jobs and economic opportunities that benefit the broader population. Think of it this way. Imagine your small town suddenly attracted dozens of millionaires and billionaires who built homes, hired local contractors, ate at local restaurants, and used local professional services. Even if these wealthy residents paid lower tax rates than they would elsewhere, their economic activity would likely generate more total tax revenue and economic activity than existed before they arrived. This is essentially what has happened in Liechtenstein on a national scale. But this creates some interesting social and political tensions that are worth examining. When a significant portion of your country's wealth comes from serving the financial needs of foreign billionaires, you become dependent on maintaining policies that keep them happy. This can create situations where the interests of wealthy foreign residents might conflict with what ordinary citizens would prefer. For example, suppose Liechtenstein citizens wanted to implement stricter environmental regulations that might make the country less attractive to certain types of businesses. The prince might need to balance the democratic wishes of citizens against the economic reality that losing wealthy residents could harm everyone's prosperity. This is a more complex version of the classic tension between economic growth and other social values, but with the added complication of absolute monarchy. Let's also consider how international pressure affects this system. Other European countries, particularly Germany and France, have long complained that tax havens like Liechtenstein allow their wealthy citizens to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. This has led to increasing pressure for financial transparency and information sharing. Liechtenstein has had to adapt by becoming more cooperative with foreign tax authorities while still maintaining enough advantages to attract wealthy clients. Here's a crucial development you should understand. Liechtenstein is no longer the secretive, no questions asked tax haven it once was. The country now complies with international standards for financial transparency and automatically shares tax information with other countries. But rather than destroying its tax haven status, this has actually made it more legitimate and sustainable. Wealthy individuals can still benefit from favorable tax rates and sophisticated financial services, but they can't simply hide money from their home country's tax authorities. This evolution illustrates something important about how modern tax havens operate. They're not primarily about tax evasion, which is illegal, but about tax optimization within legal frameworks. Liechtenstein offers wealthy individuals legitimate ways to structure their finances that minimize tax burden while complying with international law. This distinction matters because it helps explain why the system remains sustainable despite international pressure. Now let's think about what this means for understanding Liechtenstein's political system. The country's success as a tax haven creates a form of economic validation for its absolute monarchy. Critics might argue that absolute rule is outdated or undemocratic, but it's hard to argue with the results. Liechtenstein has achieved remarkable prosperity by attracting and serving wealthy clients who value the stability and predictability that comes with princely rule. This raises some fascinating questions about the relationship between political systems and economic outcomes. Does Liechtenstein's success prove that absolute monarchy can work in modern circumstances? Or does it simply show that any political system can succeed if it finds the right economic niche? The answer probably depends on whether you think the current system is sustainable in the long term. Number 3, it accidentally invaded Switzerland and no one noticed. The 2007 incident wasn't even the most dramatic of these accidental invasions. Let me take you back to the first recorded incident, which happened on December 5, 1985, when the Swiss army was conducting a training exercise with surface-to-air missiles. Despite bad weather and strong winds, they decided to launch their rockets anyway, and the missiles ended up straight into Liechtenstein's Barnard forest. Imagine being a Liechtenstein forest ranger and suddenly discovering unexploded Swiss military ordnance in your woods. This first incident was different from the later ones because it involved actual weapons being fired into Liechtenstein territory, not just soldiers wandering across the border. The first time was probably the only aggressive accident of the bunch. During an artillery exercise, the Swiss army had launched munitions in the middle of winter. This could have been genuinely dangerous if anyone had been in the area where the missiles landed. The pattern continued with another incident where Swiss recruits and their commanders only realized they were in the wrong country when they found themselves in Triesenberg, which is located in Liechtenstein. Think about the gradual dawning of realization these soldiers must have experienced. First noticing that the terrain didn't match their maps, then seeing unfamiliar place names, and finally understanding they had marched their entire unit into a foreign country. Now, let's examine why these incidents are simultaneously serious diplomatic matters and sources of gentle humor. From a technical legal standpoint, these could be considered acts of war. Foreign military forces entering sovereign territory without permission is typically treated as an invasion, regardless of intent. However, the response from Liechtenstein officials shows us something important about how international relations actually work between friendly nations. A spokesman from Liechtenstein said it's not like they invaded with attack helicopters, perfectly capturing the proportionate response to these mishaps. This reaction tells us that context and relationship matter enormously in international law. When Switzerland accidentally sends soldiers into Liechtenstein, it's treated as an embarrassing mistake between friends. If the same thing happened between countries with hostile relationships, it could trigger a major international crisis. Let's think about what these incidents reveal about the unique relationship between these two countries. Switzerland and Liechtenstein are neighbours with open borders, so it's not completely a surprise that soldiers may accidentally wander over. This open border arrangement is possible because both countries have extraordinary levels of trust and cooperation. Switzerland actually handles Liechtenstein's defence as part of their bilateral agreements, which makes these invasions even more absurd. Switzerland is accidentally invading a country it's supposed to be protecting. Here's where we can see how geography and politics intersect in fascinating ways. Liechtenstein's survival as an independent microstate depends partly on the fact that its neighbours are stable, peaceful democracies with no territorial ambitions. If Liechtenstein was surrounded by aggressive powers, these border incidents would be far more serious. Instead, the biggest military threat the country faces appears to be getting lost Swiss soldiers who can't read maps properly in bad weather. The repeated nature of these incidents also tells us something about military training and competence. You might think that after the first accidental invasion, the Swiss military would have implemented better procedures to prevent it from happening again. Yet, it kept occurring, suggesting that the combination of unmarked borders, difficult terrain, and adverse weather conditions creates ongoing challenges for military navigation that aren't easily solved. Consider the diplomatic implications of these mishaps. Switzerland even officially apologized for these incidents, which shows that both countries take sovereignty seriously, even when violations are clearly accidental. This formal acknowledgement serves an important function. It maintains the principle that borders matter while also demonstrating that the violation was unintentional. These incidents also highlight something interesting about modern military technology and training. You might assume that with GPS and modern navigation equipment, it would be impossible for an entire company of soldiers to get lost and cross an international border without realizing it. Yet in 2007, 170 troops armed with rifles, but apparently not with a GPS, stumbled into Liechtenstein, suggesting that basic navigation skills and map reading remain important even in our high-tech age. From Liechtenstein's perspective, these incidents present an interesting challenge. The country maintains its sovereignty and independence partly through international recognition and respect for its borders. When those borders are accidentally violated, even by friendly neighbours, it requires a careful diplomatic response that upholds the principle of sovereignty while not damaging important relationships. The story becomes even more interesting when you consider that there are even more anecdotes of the Swiss army accidentally ending up in other neighbouring countries like France and Italy. This suggests that Switzerland's military navigation challenges aren't unique to its relationship with Liechtenstein, but reflect broader issues with training in mountainous, border region terrain. What makes these Swiss invasions particularly charming is how they contrast with the more dramatic military history of the region. During World War II, there was actually a planned invasion of Switzerland and Liechtenstein by the Axis powers called Operation Tannenbaum, which fortunately never occurred. The contrast between a serious planned invasion during wartime and these bumbling peacetime accidents perfectly captures how much European international relations have changed over the past several decades. These incidents also serve as a reminder that international relations aren't always conducted in the formal settings of embassies and summit meetings. Sometimes diplomacy happens when embarrassed military officers have to call their counterparts in neighbouring countries to apologise for accidentally invading them in the rain. Number 4. It's one of the world's only double landlocked countries. Liechtenstein is one of just 2 countries on Earth that's double landlocked, meaning it's landlocked by other landlocked countries. The only other, Uzbekistan. This concept of being double landlocked creates some fascinating implications that go far beyond simple geography. Let me help you understand what double landlocked actually means by building up from simpler concepts. First, let's make sure we're clear on what landlocked means in the basic sense. A landlocked country is one that has no direct access to the ocean. It's completely surrounded by other countries' territory. Think of countries like Switzerland, Austria, or Paraguay. If you're in one of these countries and want to reach the ocean, you have to cross through at least one other country's territory to get there. Now, here's where the concept gets more interesting. Most landlocked countries are surrounded by a mix of other landlocked countries and countries that do have ocean access. For example, if you're in Austria, you're surrounded by countries like Germany and Italy, which have their own coastlines. So even though Austria itself is landlocked, it's relatively easy to reach the ocean by crossing just one border. But double landlocked is a much more restrictive situation. A double landlocked country is surrounded entirely by other landlocked countries. This means that to reach the ocean from a double landlocked country, you have to cross through at least 2 different countries' territories. Think of it like being trapped inside a series of nested boxes. You have to open multiple layers to reach the outside world. Liechtenstein shares this extremely rare geographic situation with only one other country in the world, Uzbekistan in Central Asia. Let's examine Liechtenstein's specific situation to understand how this works in practice. Liechtenstein is completely surrounded by Switzerland to the west and south and Austria to the east and north. Both Switzerland and Austria are themselves landlocked countries with no ocean access. So if you're standing in Liechtenstein and want to reach the ocean, you must cross through either Switzerland or Austria, and then cross through yet another country that actually has a coastline. Now, let me help you understand why this geographic situation is so significant by walking through the practical implications. Imagine you're a business owner in Liechtenstein who wants to import goods from overseas or export products to international markets. Your goods must travel through at least 2 different countries' territories, each with their own customs regulations, transportation infrastructure, and potential political complications. This creates what economists call transaction costs, additional expenses and complications that arise simply from geographic location. Let's trace a specific example to make this concrete. Suppose you're shipping goods from Liechtenstein to the port of Hamburg in Germany. Your shipment would need to travel through Switzerland, then through Germany to reach the port. Each border crossing involves customs procedures, potential delays, and additional costs. Compare this to a business in Germany that can ship directly to Hamburg, or even a business in landlocked Switzerland that only needs to cross one border to reach the same port. But here's where we need to think more deeply about how modern international relations and economic agreements can mitigate these geographic challenges. Liechtenstein benefits enormously from being embedded within the European economic and political system. The country is part of the European Economic Area, which means goods can move freely across borders without traditional customs barriers. It's also part of the Schengen area, which eliminates passport controls for people traveling between member countries. Number 5, it's tiny, but incredibly rich. With just 38,000 residents, Liechtenstein has one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world. How? Advanced manufacturing, niche tech industries, and, yes, a little banking magic. Let me start by helping you grasp just how tiny and how rich Liechtenstein really is, because the numbers are almost hard to believe. The entire country covers just 160 square kilometers. That's smaller than Washington, D.C., and about 1/4 the size of New York City. You could literally walk across the entire country in a few hours, yet this tiny nation has a GDP per capita of around $180,000, making it one of the wealthiest countries in the world by that measure. To put this in perspective, that's nearly 3 times higher than the United States and about twice as high as Switzerland, which is already considered very wealthy. Now let's think about what these numbers actually mean in practical terms. When economists talk about GDP per capita, they're essentially asking, if we took all the economic activity in a country and divided it equally among all the residents, how much would each person get? In Liechtenstein's case, the answer suggests that each resident is associated with an enormous amount of economic value creation. But here's where we need to be careful about how we interpret these statistics, because they reveal something crucial about how small economies can work differently than large ones. Remember that Liechtenstein has only about 39,000 residents, but it hosts thousands of businesses and manages assets for clients from around the world. When these international businesses generate revenue while operating from Liechtenstein, that revenue gets counted as part of the country's GDP, even though much of the actual economic activity might be serving clients elsewhere. Think of it this way. Imagine you set up a consulting business in your garage that serves clients all over the world. Your garage hasn't actually gotten any bigger, but suddenly it's the headquarters for a business that might generate millions in revenue. Liechtenstein functions somewhat like that garage. It's a small physical space that serves as the legal and operational base for economic activities that extend far beyond its borders. Let me help you understand the specific mechanisms that allow such a small country to generate such wealth. The foundation of Liechtenstein's prosperity rests on what economists call comparative advantage, the idea that countries should specialize in what they do best relative to others. For Liechtenstein, this specialization is focused on financial services, particularly private banking, asset management, and what we might call wealth structuring for high net worth individuals and families. To grasp why this specialization is so profitable, consider what wealthy individuals and families actually need. They're not just looking for places to store money. They need sophisticated legal structures to manage inheritance, minimize taxes legally, protect assets from political instability, and organize complex international business arrangements. Creating and managing these structures requires highly specialized expertise, and clients are willing to pay substantial fees for high-quality service. Now, here's where the economics get really interesting. Financial services have what economists call increasing returns to scale. The more expertise and reputation you build, the more valuable your services become and the higher fees you can charge. A small country like Liechtenstein can compete with much larger financial centers precisely because size doesn't matter as much as expertise, reputation, and regulatory framework in this industry. Let me walk you through a concrete example to make this clearer. Suppose you're a wealthy family with assets spread across multiple countries, and you need to structure your wealth to minimize taxes while ensuring smooth inheritance planning. You might pay hundreds of thousands or even millions in fees to financial advisors, lawyers, and asset managers who can create the right legal structures and manage them over time. From Liechtenstein's perspective, attracting just a few hundred such clients can generate enormous economic activity relative to the country's small population. But we need to dig deeper into why wealthy clients choose Liechtenstein over larger financial centers like London, New York, or Geneva. This is where the unique combination of factors we've discussed in our previous conversations becomes crucial. The political stability provided by the princely system, the country's tradition of financial privacy, its location in the heart of Europe, and its favorable tax regime all work together to create what business strategists call a value proposition that's difficult for competitors to replicate. Think about this from a risk management perspective. Wealthy individuals worry about political changes that might affect their wealth. They've seen how democracies can suddenly change tax policies when new governments are elected, or how political instability can threaten asset security. Liechtenstein's absolute monarchy, while unusual, actually provides a form of political insurance. Major policy changes are less likely because they don't depend on the unpredictable outcomes of democratic elections. Now let's consider how this wealth creation affects ordinary citizens of Liechtenstein. You might think that all this financial activity primarily benefits wealthy foreigners, but the economic effects spread throughout the small society in interesting ways. The financial services industry requires skilled workers, lawyers, accountants, banking professionals, administrative staff, who command high salaries. These well-paid workers then spend money on local services, housing and goods, creating what economists call